Welcome to the break room. Hope you brought your nerves and maybe a snack, because today's stories are the kind that'll make your skin crawl faster than a spider on a bathroom wall. Fair warning, I will, at some point, attempt an Australian accent. It's horrifying for all the wrong reasons. But more importantly, today's theme is farm work, and the bizarre, unexplainable and downright chilling things that have happened out in the fields, barns and silos. Think strange animal behavior, eerie noises in the dark, and sightings that'll make you question what's really living out there in the countryside. So settle in, take a long sip of whatever's keeping you grounded, and let's get into another round of true and terrifying work stories. Story 1. Field of Bones by F. Sum. Up here in northern Wisconsin, I was 25 years old, trying to keep my family's orchard running. The orchard itself was old. My grandfather planted the first row of apple trees back in the 1920s, on land that had been in use for much longer than anyone really knew. Locals sometimes whispered about old settlers' graves, or even earlier Native American burial sites somewhere on the stretch of property, but it was usually dismissed as gossip, the kind of folklore that passes around during harvest season. I first discovered something suspicious in the early 90s, when I tried to dig up a new irrigation ditch by the far edge of the orchard, the part where the land slopes toward a small wooded area. My shovel hit something hard. Of course I expected a rock, but after scraping away the dirt, I realized I was looking at a piece of bone, a leg bone, human-sized. It was an unsettling moment, standing there with a half-dug ditch, the midday sun beating down, the whir of distant farm machinery, and a bone that clearly didn't belong to an animal. I called the police. An officer came out and took some photos, bagging up the remains. They told me not to disturb the area further. A week later, the county office got in touch, basically letting me know that if it was part of a historic or Native American burial site, I should contact the appropriate heritage group. At the time, I wasn't sure which group that would be, but the county gave me a name. I followed up once, got bounced around, and eventually let the matter rest, partly because I was busy with orchard work, but also because something in me resisted the idea of digging any deeper. The orchard was my livelihood, and I worried any official investigation would get it shut down. Over the next year or two, life went on. I kept my orchard going with help from two seasonal farmhands, Hector and Lyle. We'd prune the trees in spring, deal with irrigation in summer, and harvest come fall. But we kept stumbling over more bones, usually small fragments. Sometimes, one of us would toss aside a half-buried branch, only to see a shard of human rib or a piece of skull. It was never a full skeleton, which made it somehow creepier. Actually, the orchard seemed to be giving up bits of the dead, slowly and reluctantly. I did my due diligence each time, bagging up the fragments, calling the county, but the sheriff's department looked exhausted by it. They'd basically say, "Just set them aside, and we'll tell you when we can send someone out." Then they never had time. The orchard was old, but these remains were even older. As best as anyone could tell, there was nothing criminal about it, just a piece of land that had once been a resting ground for someone, or multiple someones. One deputy told me they suspected it might be a pioneer-era cemetery that was never properly recorded. Another said it could belong to a local tribe. Either way, it was unmarked and half forgotten. That was the official side of it. Privately, though, I started to notice things. The orchard had always had its quirks, like random cold spots or wind gusts that felt stronger than they should be. But in '98, it got worse. During the late summer, Hector mentioned that he sometimes felt like someone was watching him from the rows. Lyle had told me he heard murmuring voices when he worked alone trimming branches. He said he looked around at the time but didn't find anything but swaying leaves. Both of them teased each other about it, saying they were paranoid, but I made sure to take note. One afternoon, I was walking through the orchard rows, checking for pests. I swear I heard a faint chanting sound, like a chorus rising and falling. I stopped and listened real close, but the sound faded behind rustling leaves, making me think it could have been the wind, could have been the rustling leaves themselves, but it gave me goosebumps. I brushed it off and went back to my chores. Harvest season that year was particularly strange. We had an early run of warm weather, which meant the apples were ready ahead of schedule. Hector and Lyle were picking in the back rows when I heard Lyle shout. I ran over to find him crouched by the base of a tree, white-faced. He pointed at the ground, and there, half buried in the dirt, was a human skull, clean, empty eye sockets staring back. Lyle said he'd almost tripped over it. By then, I'd somewhat gotten accustomed to finding remains, but seeing a skull that intact was on another level. We carefully lifted it, placed it in a bucket, and took it to the barn. I made my usual call to the local authorities. They said they'd try to swing by next week. The orchard was too busy for me to wait around for them, so I just kept the skull in a sealed box until they could come. That evening, we were storing crates of apples in the barn, and the atmosphere felt tense. Hector found an excuse to leave early. He didn't seem to be feeling well. Lyle stuck around to finish the day's load, but we mostly worked quietly. Around sunset, I heard some strange thumps outside. It sounded like someone banging on a tree trunk. I stepped out to check it out. The orchard was eerily still. Then I saw movement between the trees. A figure. Just for a split second, it looked like a woman in a long dress, but with the way the sun was angled, I couldn't see more details. Now, this part sounds crazy, but I swear she seemed to drift, not walk. My heart jumped, and I blinked, thinking I was seeing things. When I peered closer, no one was there. I can't tell you for sure if it was real, but from what I thought I saw, it left me shaken. A few nights later, I woke up in the middle of the night to a clattering sound in the barn. I live in the farmhouse about 30 yards from the orchard. I got out of bed, threw on a jacket and grabbed a flashlight. It must have been around 2 a.m. It was cold and the grass was wet with dew. I could tell from there that the barn door was slightly ajar, even though I always bolted it shut each night. Inside, I found 2 crates of apples overturned, scattered across the floor. The sealed box where I'd placed the skull was open, and the skull was missing. I quickly thought maybe Hector or Lyle had come in for some reason, but that made no sense. So I called out, "Hello? Anybody here?" There wasn't a response. I flicked on the overhead light and looked in every corner. There was no sign of forced entry, no trace of anyone having been here except for the overturned apples and missing skull. Something about all this made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. I closed the barn door and bolted it again. I then walked back to the house, feeling creeped out. The day after that, I told Lyle what happened. He told me that sounded pretty messed up. Hector wouldn't even talk about it. He just shook his head. A sheriff's deputy who finally showed up took my statement about the missing skull, but looked at me like I might be losing it. He made a note and said he'd file it away. I could tell he had no intention of investigating further. In a way, I guess I couldn't blame him for that. There was no real crime being committed here, except maybe trespassing. As the harvest wrapped up, I decided to try and find some historical records on our land. I drove to the local historical society, rummaging through old maps and diaries and some property records. Most of it indicated the orchard was farmland since the mid-1800s, but there was one battered-looking ledger mentioning several unmarked graves. Even that claimed they weren't sure if it was pioneer or native, and no one had documented precisely where they were. Another note hinted that the earliest settlers had conflicts with local tribes, and some people were buried hastily after skirmishes. Sadly, that's all I found. Just enough to confirm that my orchard sat on land with a complicated past, but the bone fragments were enough to tell me that already. The final straw came during the last week of that season. I was in the orchard alone, clearing fallen branches. By that point, the sun was nearly down. It was then that I heard the faint singing or chanting again. This time it felt closer, more layered, like there were multiple voices to it. I stood stock still, wondering where the sound was coming from, but it was both clear and vague in a way that I couldn't tell. The wind had picked up, making it more difficult, and then I caught glimpses of shadowy shapes between the rows. These weren't solid figures, more like flickers at the edges of my vision. I was honestly starting to feel scared. The orchard felt wrong, like it didn't want me here. Until then, I had never run from my own orchard before, but that night, I hurried back to the farmhouse, leaving branches where they lay. After the harvest ended, I finally made contact with a local group that dealt with ancient and historical burial sites. I explained my entire situation, bones and remains we'd found over the years. I even felt brave enough to tell them about these strange occurrences. They were surprisingly understanding. Heck, if you ask me, it almost sounded like they'd heard that before. They said they would send someone out to survey the land, see if they could confirm any old grave or sacred sites. They showed up a few weeks later, 2 folks who specialized in cultural resources. They took photos, measured a few areas, making notes. They said it would likely take time to gather a full team, do proper ground-penetrating radar scans, and figure out all the next steps. They thanked me for not disturbing the site further. What really sucks, though, is I never did hear back from them. Maybe my case got lost in the bureaucracy. By the end of the season, the orchard was quiet. I didn't hear the chanting again, and I didn't see any shadows in the corners of my eyes. And oddly enough, I stopped finding bones. Maybe those two things were coincidences to happen at the same time, or maybe they were connected. If you were to ask me right now, I think the land is haunted, but I still do wonder who took that skull and where might it be these days. Story 2. We had problems with a calf from fabled folk, and this happened in eastern Montana. I had just graduated high school, and unlike most of my friends, college didn't seem like the right path for me. I got a job working at a nearby ranch. This particular ranch had a couple hundred head of cattle spread across miles of rolling pasture. There was a big barn that always smelled of sweet hay and a bunkhouse for the seasonal hands. I moved in, thinking I'd spend maybe a year saving up some money and getting a feel for ranch life before deciding on my next move. It didn't take long for me to realize that on a ranch, bizarre things might happen. The strangest by far was the calf that came back. It was a clear summer morning, and I'd gotten up early, heading out to the south field to check on a group of cows. They were due to calve in the spring, so by summer, each mother usually had a sprightly little calf trotting alongside. They were super cute. We kept an eye on them, making sure none of them wandered off too far, got snagged in the barbed wire fences, got eaten by predators, or seemed sick. I was riding along the fence line when I saw one of the black Angus calves lying still near the tall grass. I dismounted and walked over. Then I felt my heart drop. The little calf looked to be maybe a month or two old, but it wasn't breathing. As near as I could tell, the poor thing had managed to wedge its head in a small erosion hole by the fence. There weren't any marks suggesting a predator had gotten to her, and the ground around her was damp from an overnight sprinkle. My best guess was she lost her footing on the slope, got stuck, and couldn't free herself. I cursed under my breath. Losing livestock was never easy around here, especially a calf. They're the ranch's future, and when you're the one to find one like this, it always feels like your fault, and then you have the duty to report it. I radioed the ranch foreman, who told me to go ahead and load the calf onto the bed of the old pickup. He met me near the barn, took one look, and shook his head. We had a dedicated spot off by a small gully where we'd bury animals that died out in the pasture. It might sound grim, but it's a normal practice when you have a ranch this big. Andrew helped me dig a proper hole, and we put the calf in. We said a few words, mostly out of respect, then covered it up. I remember noticing the calf had a distinctive white patch that looked like a little triangle on its right flank. It stood out to me because black Angus calves normally don't have that sort of white patch, hence the name. I said something about it at the time because it made me wonder if it had some crossbreed genetics. Fast forward a few days, work kept me busy, as it usually does. I was mending fences and moving irrigation lines, often checking salt blocks for the cattle. I was out in the west pasture one evening, counting heads to make sure all the animals were accounted for. It was then that I saw a small calf near the tree line. It caught my eye pretty quickly because it had the same exact triangular white mark on its flank. I actually felt my stomach drop. I remember what I thought then. That's not right. We buried that thing. I approached it, trying not to spook it. The calf here seemed healthy. Its ears were twitching, and its tail was flicking at flies. Obviously, I was thinking I may have mixed up a different calf that also had some unusual coloring. Still, I wasn't so sure about that. That distinct shape, the exact placement, it was identical. I tried to get near enough to see its ear tag, but it trotted off to rejoin the main herd before I could read it. For the rest of the day, I wrestled with the thought that I'd seen a calf that should no longer be here. That night at supper, I casually mentioned it to Andrew and a couple of the other ranch hands. They mostly shrugged. Andrew said we do occasionally have anomalies in coloring, or maybe I was thinking of a different calf altogether, that they just looked similar. I didn't push it. I wasn't fully convinced of my own story yet anyway. Over the next week, I was paying close attention to every calf I saw, just in case, especially those in the west pasture. We didn't have an exact head count of newborns with odd markings, so it wasn't impossible that another calf had a patch like that. But day after day, I kept spotting the same one. Same triangular patch, same size. And every time I'd try to get close to it, it would vanish into the cluster of cows. I started to joke about it in my own head, calling it the ghost calf. The turning point came one afternoon when I was out riding with my friend and fellow ranch hand. I'll call him P. We were herding a section of the cattle into a smaller enclosure for vaccinations, a routine chore. As we guided them, I spotted the calf again. I poked P with my elbow and said, "Hey, look, see that white triangle on its flank? We found a calf with that exact pattern last week, and it was dead." P raised an eyebrow, clearly skeptical, and he did admit it was kind of weird. I convinced him to try to rope the calf, just a little loop around it, long enough to read the ear tag. But the calf darted behind its mother, and the rope missed. Once a calf hides behind a protective cow, good luck trying to pull it away without risking a kick. When we both got back to the barn, P told Andrew about what happened. Andrew studied us both, then rubbed his chin and muttered something about records. We kept decent records on births, but as I said before, we don't keep exact details of markings. Not always. They can be overlooked in a scramble. He checked the ledger and found that the only calf with a confirmed odd marking in that group was the one we had documented as deceased. Someone had even scribbled a note about that triangular patch. Our conversation went from curious to weird in a hurry. Andrew walked out to the burial site with me the following morning, shovel in hand. He insisted we check the spot to make sure the calf was still there. Maybe a predator or scavenger dug it up, and we'd at least find the remains. We dug probably 5 feet down until we hit that burlap feed sack we'd used to wrap the poor thing's hind legs. We pulled it back, and sure enough, the calf's body was right there. It was rotting and smelled foul, but definitely the same calf we'd buried. The triangular patch was visible beneath the dirt. Andrew just stared, speechless for a second. He reared back and didn't say much beyond, "We'll figure this out." As we left, I noticed his hands shaking a bit on the shovel. I wasn't feeling too great myself. From that point on, the entire ranch was abuzz with the news of a dead calf walking. Ranch hands started to tell stories about seeing it grazing near the water trough at dawn or sprinting across the open field at dusk. Some guys speculated that it had been twins. Maybe the second calf shared the same markings, but identical markings down to the shape and spot. That's not common. And we didn't have any notes about a twin birth for that mother cow. One evening, close to sunset, I decided to head out alone to the west pasture. A hunch told me I might see the calf around that time. The sky was pretty and orange. There was a gentle breeze rolling through the grass. Sure enough, after about 10 minutes of scanning the herd, I spotted it at the far edge near an old cottonwood tree. My heart pounded. I approached it slowly on foot, not wanting to spook it. As I got closer, the calf seemed calm, like it didn't mind me. I began talking in a low voice, the way you do with animals sometimes, just letting it know I wasn't a threat. But then it turned its head, and I swear there was something in those eyes that unsettled me. Not a typical calf's wide-eyed stare. I can't describe it exactly, maybe a kind of recognition or sadness. I inched close enough to finally see the ear tag number. Felt like my heart stopped, because that was the tag number of the deceased calf, no doubt about it. I nearly dropped my flashlight. Before I could do anything else, the calf jerked its head, made a strange, low, bleating sound, and took off, not just a lazy trot, more a frantic run, weaving through the other cattle. The next morning, I told Andrew I'd confirmed the tag number. He didn't even try to accuse me of lying. He knew better than that, but I could see that he was at a loss, like the rest of us. We decided the only way to settle this was to catch the calf, physically verify everything. He assembled a few of the ranch hands, and we pinned the herd in the corral. We systematically separated cows and calves, checking ear tags. We found several, but no. We combed that corral for a good hour, and not once did we see the triangular patch or the ear tag. We turned the herd back out. All of us were silent. I overheard some of the older ranch hands whisper that it's a curse, comparing it to old legends. They'd heard something about animals refusing to die, returning if their spirit was restless, that it might happen when they're buried in cursed ground. The rest of us tried to make a joke of it, saying someone was messing around or pulling pranks, but I wasn't laughing. I was starting to feel anxious every time I stepped into that pasture. A week or two passed by without any sightings. Then, as if the ranch itself had decided to move on from the mystery, everything went back to normal. Chores, branding a new batch of cattle, repairing the well pump, dealing with a mild outbreak of pink eye in some cows. Number became a half-forgotten conversation piece, something the guys would bring up around the bunkhouse after a few beers. "You see that ghost calf again?" they'd say and chuckle. I didn't see it again until late August. I was driving an ATV along the perimeter fence at dusk, checking for gaps. The wind was cold, a hint of the coming fall, and right there beyond the boundary, where the rain patch meets open range, I saw a calf. Black body, triangular patch, ear tag glinting in the last bit of sunlight. It stood perfectly still, almost like it was waiting for me to notice. My gut twisted, remembering the last time I saw that number. I stopped the ATV and killed the engine. We just stared at each other across the tall grass. Then, in a moment, the calf turned and bounded off into the distance. For a split second, I had this wild urge to chase it and kill it, but it ran beyond our fence line, into land we didn't own. I knew I had no right to follow it out there. Instead, I sat there, confused, watching it eventually vanish into the hills. That was the final time I saw the calf. After that, everything returned to the mundane realities of ranch life. I'm still at that ranch. I moved up to an assistant role. Every now and then, I look back on that summer, how we found that calf's remains in the burial site, and how it came back. If you ever find yourself in eastern Montana, driving past a herd on a ranch, keep your eyes peeled. You might catch a glimpse of that triangular patch and ear tag number, roaming between the hills like it never left. Story 3. Barn Beast from Eric. For a while, I lived in the high desert of eastern Oregon. I had a buddy named Clay who owned a ranch. Sometimes I'd done work for him, and one day I got a call from him. He remembered that I was pretty good with horses and not afraid to sleep under the stars if I needed to. I noticed Clay sounded on edge when he called. He explained a problem to me. Every few nights, one of his goats or a sheep would turn up dead. He had no idea if it was coyotes, a mountain lion, or something else entirely. The odd part was that the fence around his livestock pen was partially torn, but not in the way a coyote would do. It looked shredded, like something with real strong claws or big teeth had done the job. Clay asked if I'd come out and help watch the animals at night. He said he couldn't afford any more losses. I agreed because, honestly, I was a friend of Clay's, and I needed the extra cash. I grew up hearing stories about farm predators and strange occurrences in the desert. A part of me was excited. Maybe this could be exciting. Clay's ranch sits a good distance outside of town, near a lonely stretch of road. It has big hills, patches of junipers, and miles of grassland. He mostly raised cattle, but had recently added a flock of sheep and a small group of goats. It seemed the goats were getting hit hardest. Whatever was out there had a taste for them. When I arrived, Clay was waiting by his old barn. The man was in his 50s, tough as nails, with a sun-beaten face that told you he'd spent a lifetime in his craft. He led me around the back, where he kept the livestock pen. I remember thinking, I'll be darned. One of the corners of the chain-link fence was in bad shape, twisted and pulled outward. It had been patched with more wire, but it still looked pretty rough. "Check this out," Clay said, pointing to the fence. "I've never seen a coyote do that kind of damage. A wolf maybe, but we haven't had confirmed wolf sightings here in years." He walked me over to a small enclosure behind the barn, and that's when the rank smell hit me. The carcass of a goat, partially devoured. Flies buzzed around it. I tried not to breathe too deeply. Clay had left it in place for me to take a look. I crouched down, noticing the bite marks. They were large, bigger than a typical coyote's jaws. Whatever had done it was real messy too, not like the neat latching a big cat sometimes does. These were deep puncture wounds on the neck and shoulders. "You sure it's not a mountain lion?" I asked. Clay shrugged. "Could be," he said. "Local game ward's been out here, though. The tracks don't quite match up. Heck if I know. He showed me a footprint in the dust. It was broad, not canine or feline, and it was smeared, making it tough to be sure. Nonetheless, it gave me the creeps. I'd seen dozens of animal tracks before, but never anything like that. That first night we set up a watch. Clay had a rifle, and I had my own trusty one. We posted ourselves in folding chairs near the barn, making sure to have a lantern glowing low next to us. The livestock pen lay about 50 yards away, with a weak floodlight illuminating the fence line. The animals seemed unsettled, occasionally bleating or huddling together. Maybe I was thinking too much about whatever this thing was, but I was starting to get creeped out myself. Clay and I just sat there, scanning for movement. Around midnight, with the moon high in the sky and the night growing colder, I was about to suggest we take turns going to sleep when we suddenly heard a soft clinking on the fence. We turned our rifles in that direction. For a second, I thought I saw a dark shape slip away from the pen, but it vanished too quickly to tell if it was an actual creature or just shadows playing tricks on my eyes. Clay got up, walked over with his lantern, but found nothing. The fence was intact, no signs of tears or footprints. The next couple of days we went about ranch chores. I helped Clay repair more fences and guided the livestock to graze in different parts of the pasture. We also did some searching for tracks around the perimeter, looking for anything we could cast or photograph. We found a few scattered prints, all inconclusive though. A few were deep in the mud near the water trough, almost shaped like a canine print but longer. Another was near the barn door, as if something heavy had pressed down real hard, but still, we couldn't be sure. Night after night we took up positions near the barn. Clay had even put out extra motion sensor lights around the pen. He also tried hooking up a small radio, thinking the human voices might scare off predators. We often heard distant howls, coyotes definitely, but none of them ever ventured too close. Everything stayed quiet until one morning I woke up to Clay pounding on my bunkhouse door. "Another one," he said, looking grim. We headed out to find a ewe partially eaten, lying in the corner of the pen. The fence was torn again, this time on the opposite side, and we hadn't heard a thing. The motion lights didn't even trigger, like whatever this thing was had slipped in and out without a sound. Clay's face was red with frustration. I'd never seen him so mad. He was cussing up a storm, kicking at a broken fence post. We tried a new tactic, moving the livestock into a smaller, sturdier corral closer to the barn. We put up fresh wiring and locked them in at night. Clay installed trail cameras around the perimeter. For a few days, we caught nothing but the usual ranch wildlife, some possums, a couple of stray cats, and a few deer crossing the property. Then, on the fourth night, something attacked. We heard the racket. This time, the goats screaming and the fence rattling violently. Clay and I dashed outside with our rifles and flashlights. The corral fence was shaking as if someone was beating on it. By the time we reached it, everything went still. One of the goats lay on its side, bleeding from jagged wounds across the neck. The others milled around, panicked. Our flashlight beam swept over the corral, but we saw no predator, nothing even running off into the darkness. Clay checked the gate. It was still locked. Some of the fence bars were bent outward, like something had almost pried them open. "How does something bend steel bars?" he muttered. This time he sounded scared and mad. When we examined the trail cameras the next day, each one was asking us to format the SD card, user error or something, so we had no idea if they'd caught anything. At that point, Clay considered calling an old friend of his, a professional tracker from up north, but if you ask me, something about the situation felt beyond normal tracking expertise. I remember telling Clay, either this is a mountain lion with freakish strength, or it's something else that shouldn't be here. We tried a final stakeout, the last one I participated in before I had to leave for another job. This time, we got inside the barn's loft, giving us a higher vantage point over the corral. The night dragged on. I didn't think anything was going to happen, but something did. Near dawn. That's when I heard a faint scraping sound, like claws on wood. I whispered to Clay, "You hear that?" He nodded. We peered through a gap in the boards. Suddenly the goats started to bleat frantically. We rushed down the ladder, flung open the barn door, rifles aimed. Something behind the corral moved, a shadowy figure slipping away into the brush. We both saw it, though maybe just the barest glimpse, but we saw something. It was large, hunched, covered in dark fur, but in a pattern that looked patchy, like half mangy. We caught it in time to see it vault over a low section of the fence impossibly fast before disappearing. Clay fired 2 rounds but didn't hit it. One of the goats lay near the fence, wounds still fresh. They looked like razor-sharp claw marks. A couple of days later, I packed up my things. I had other obligations, and sadly, I had to leave Clay to handle the ranch on his own. I said goodbye to him with an unsettling handshake. He thanked me for coming out and said he would keep in touch. A month later, I got a call from him with good news. He said the attacks had finally stopped, just as mysteriously as they started. He never did find out what it was. The only sign was a final set of gouges in the fence, as though something had tested it one last time before moving on. It wasn't the most vivid sighting. Sure, we never got a close look, never directly attacked, but to really experience something like that in real life, it chills you to the bone. It gives you that good, confused fright that stays with you for the rest of your life. The kind of thing you're good for weeks at a time without thinking about, but then you'll have that random night where you remember it, and suddenly you're scared of the dark again. Anyway, that's my story. Thanks for listening. Story 4. I'd like to tell you I'm a practical guy, never one to dwell on the paranormal. I get up before sunrise every day and tend to the fields. After some local news, I go to bed. No fuss, no drama. I don't even know how to use computers very well. My niece is typing this for me. Bless her heart. I wanted to share this after hearing some similar stories on the Unexplained Encounters podcast. It happened one summer, and if I'd known what was going to happen that night, I would have gone to bed early. My farm is a modest patch of land in southern Iowa, the kind of place where you can see headlights from your neighbor's driveway if you stand in the right spot. Not too remote, not urban either. Lots of fields, a few scattered trees, and a long gravel road leading to the highway. I grow soybeans and corn, alternating each season. It pays the bills, and we save or give to friends and family. It was mid-June when this happened. I was out in the field past dinner time because the forecast warned of heavy rains the next day, and I really had to finish spraying some herbicide on the soybeans. I had been putting it off, and the cost of seeds and supplies was getting high, which is nothing compared to now, but you know what I mean. Letting weeds overrun your fields could ruin the season. I hopped in my old tractor around sunset, figuring a few more hours wouldn't kill me. It didn't take long to get lost in the routine like usual. I lined up the sprayer, drove straight, and kept an eye out for clumps of weeds. The engine chugged along steady, and the sound always comforted me. A couple of times I had to fight not to fall asleep. Somewhere after 9 p.m., I started to feel the usual nighttime hush settle in. There were no birds, no distant hum of other machinery, just me and the crickets. An occasional breeze would stray in through the neighbor's cornfield, but that was about it. I was halfway through my last pass when I noticed something moving along the far edge of the field. Deer, I thought. They're always out there looking for an easy meal in the rows. I flicked on the auxiliary lights for a better view, but whatever it was had already slipped behind the soybean plants, out of sight. Not my problem, I thought. Wildlife is part of the package out here in rural Iowa, so I kept going. A few minutes later, I caught movement again, this time closer. The shape was low to the ground, crawling on all fours like a dog. So, that's what I thought it was. Maybe a neighbor's stray dog, or heck, even a wild dog. There was the rare chance it was a coyote, but with everyone out here owning guns for just that, it was doubtful. Those critters had the fear of God in them, so I figured it was a dog, or maybe a feral hog. I slowed down the tractor and shone my headlights in that direction, but the figure darted away, sticking close to the darker spots at the edge of my beam. That's something, I thought, but not enough to stop me from finishing the job. I'd done my due diligence trying to see what it was. No use dwelling on some animal that clearly didn't want to be found. Coyote, dog, or hog. I'd find signs of it in the field eventually, like scat or prints. With that in mind, I kept going. I moved to a new section of the field, and things started to escalate. The perimeter fence sat about 40 yards to my left, right there, and in the corner of my eye I glimpsed something climb over it. It was odd enough to make me slam the brakes and look through the glare of the headlights. I couldn't make out the details, just the silhouette. but it was standing upright like a person, and it did look human in shape, but the limbs were too long and too spindly. If it was a person, maybe they were holding something in their hands. It gave me a chill. There shouldn't be anybody out here on this property after dark. I stared at it for a moment, wondering if my eyes were just finding human-like shapes in the dark, like you do when you're a kid and you're looking at clothes in a laundry basket or on a chair. I had to be sure it wasn't a trespasser, but then it started to move, and the way it moved was weirdly graceful. I raised an eyebrow, and just then it dropped back out of sight. I'm not the type to spook easily. I hear that a lot on these shows, but I've lived here my whole life. I've seen weird weather phenomena, had raccoons jump at me from behind hay bales out of nowhere, the works, but something about the way that figure moved gave me the heebie-jeebies. I had a decision to make: keep working or head back to the farmhouse and go to bed, tackle it in the morning. Stubborn pride told me I'd come this far, and it was my land, so I might as well finish. I was nearly done spraying when I heard a scratching sound on the rear of my tractor. It was faint, but I could hear it, and I wondered if I had run over something that got caught in the wheel. I turned in my seat, expecting some unseen branch or limb to be scratching at the metal of the tractor, but I didn't see anything, just shadows. I pointed a flashlight back there. Nothing, just the empty hitch and the sprayer rig. I was getting a bit creeped out. I was hesitant, but I got out anyway. I did a walk around with the flashlight. Everything looked normal, no damage or debris, nothing, but the scratch marks on the metal didn't make me feel better. It just made me more confused as to what I had heard. I climbed back in and fired up the tractor once more. Not minutes later, this eerie sound reached me through the cab's open window. I swear to God it sounded like a laugh. A soft, raspy laugh, like someone holding back a cough and laughing at the same time. I swiveled around, looking all over for something, anything. The hairs on my arms stood straight up. My instincts were telling me this wasn't a normal person's laugh, more like a mocking imitation of one. I flicked on the interior cab light, needing some sense of security, but it only made the outside darker by contrast. I turned the tractor around, deciding I'd had enough for the night. The last row could wait. Just as I started to head back, the engine sputtered. The machine was old, but it hardly ever gave me trouble. I shifted gears, trying to keep it from stalling. That laugh came again, this time from the opposite side of the field, like something was moving around me in a circle. I gunned the throttle, forcing the tractor toward the gravel road. Then I felt a thud on the metal roof of the cab. It sounded like someone had landed on it. I can't lie to you here. I began to panic. I ducked, forgetting that there was a roof above me. I couldn't see anything from inside the cab, so I reached for the door handle, but then I stopped. Every instinct I had was screaming at me not to open that door, but I had to know what was on top of me. I cracked the door open and shone the flashlight up. Nothing. Not a soul. Not even a dent. But there were fresh scratch marks on the metal, like someone's filthy long nails had been raked across it. My hand was shaking so hard, I couldn't keep the flashlight steady. Then there was another laugh, echoing somewhere further away, deeper in the field. I swear to God it sounded amused. Something was out here playing with me, and it was happy about how scared it had me. I slammed the door shut, nearly dropping the darn flashlight. I jammed the tractor back into gear, ignoring the strain of the engine, and took off down the road. In the mirror, I thought I saw a flicker of a lanky figure bounding across the rows on all fours, but I didn't look directly, too scared to. When I finally reached the safety of my driveway, the tractor sputtered out for good, and I abandoned it right there in front of the barn. My legs felt real wobbly as I dashed toward my farmhouse. That was one of the scariest moments of my life, sprinting from the tractor to the door in utter darkness, knowing something was out there with me. I made it, locked every door, checked every window, and sat on that living room couch for an hour, hugging a rifle in my lap. I was waiting for something to try to get in, but that never happened. The next day, I double-checked. There were scratch marks on that tractor roof. The soil around the area where I'd stopped was turned up too. Footprints from something on two legs which looked like it switched to a four-legged stride. Paranormal prankster from Clark. I was desperate to make sense of it. Maybe I was misreading a pattern. Maybe there were a bunch of animals out here for some reason, churning everything up. But it didn't look like a deer, a coyote, or a dog. Too wide, too uneven. I called a buddy in town who does a bit of coyote hunting. I told him the gist of the story without too many crazy details. He agreed to come by that evening to see if we could spot something. By the time dusk rolled around, though, I had lost my nerve. I was telling myself that if we went looking, we might not make it back. So, I never went to investigate with him. I told him to go home and thanked him for coming out. I haven't sprayed a field after dark since, I'll be honest with you, I start leaving the fields a little overgrown once dusk settles in. Sure, it can make you lose a bit of the yield, but nothing's worth feeling that raw fear again, like you're just a rat in a maze for something that thinks it's entertaining to watch you squirm. Have you ever been that scared? So scared that a second run back to your front door has you panicking, nearly for your life, and you can almost feel something right behind you, ready to drag you away into the dark. That's how I felt that one time, kind of like when Dunkin' Donuts accidentally put a dozen nitro shots in my coffee or something. Man, I'm still here by some miracle. I've never been one for letting the unknown shake me, but that night, I realized there's a whole other level of terror you can't fight, something beyond reason or explanation. Sometimes I catch myself thinking about that laugh, how it mocked me, and how everything about that encounter felt so off, so unreal. Still, I can't shake the feeling that there's something out there, something that watches, something that's not interested in causing harm, but rather, it wants to watch your reaction, wants to see just how far it can push you. It's been a few years since then, but I haven't gone back to that field after dark. Maybe it's a weakness. Maybe I'll never know what it was. But some things you just can't unsee or unhear, so I've left the tractor where it broke down, and I do my work by daylight. Story 5. I'm an agronomist, specializing in desert land cultivation. This job has taken me to some cool, out-of-the-way places. Egypt, as you might know, is a land rich in treasures and also steeped in paranormal mysteries. My first brush with the supernatural happened right after I graduated, when I began working on a remote farm located about 30 kilometers from the nearest signs of civilization. One night after finishing my work, I decided to take a walk into the open desert. There was a hill nearby where I had prepared a small campsite with a fire pit earlier. The night was eerily silent. No wind, no sounds of insects, just unnaturally still and quiet. It was also pitch dark. No moonlight or stars could be seen. Somehow, it made my headlamp seem useless. I tried not to ponder on it too much. I made my way to the hill, carrying some firewood I'd gathered earlier. When I tried to light the fire, it was oddly difficult, as if the wood did not want to catch. After several minutes of struggling, the fire finally caught, but it wasn't right. The flames roared like a gas torch, bright and intense, before suddenly settling down into a normal blaze. About half an hour later, I felt a sudden wave of heat pass through my body, like spots of fire pressing against my chest. Then, out of nowhere, I heard the piercing scream of a woman. It was loud, close, and I mean almost right in my ears, and yet I couldn't figure out where it was coming from. Terrified, I ran back to the farm's headquarters. When I glanced back at the hill, my fire was out. No, actually, there was no trace of it at all. Shaken up, I recounted the experience to the site manager. He listened calmly before breaking into a laugh. "She was there," he said cryptically. "Who?" I asked. "The Princess of the Hill," he replied. He explained that she was one of the jinn who originally inhabited the area. She wasn't harmful, but she despised fire. He then shared an old tale from the 50s, when the site was first being constructed. Back then, a young security officer was stationed on the same hill. He had been strictly warned not to light any fires there, a rule he followed for days until boredom got the better of him. As soon as he lit a fire, a woman appeared out of the darkness, running right towards him. She confronted him, saying, "Didn't they tell you not to light a fire here?" The terrified guard fled down the hill, only to be chased by a massive black dog with gleaming teeth that nearly caught his legs. Suddenly, a white shadow appeared out of nowhere and attacked the dog. Since then, no one dared to use that hill for anything, until I unknowingly chose it as my campsite. Curious about the story, I later spoke to an old Bedouin chief whose tribe had lived in the area for centuries. He explained that this woman was once a mother who had perished in a fire along with her children when their tent caught a blaze. Since then, her soul had remained on the hill, protecting it and harming no one unless someone lit a fire. If you enjoyed my story, I'm happy to share more. The desert, after all, is never truly empty. The Princess on the Hill by Rad Juan. Story 6. I once found myself working on a farm in the northern Midlands of Tasmania, not exactly a place many consider for travel. I know I certainly didn't think of it when I threw my name out on an Australian farm work group on Facebook. Raised on a grain farm in Saskatchewan, Canada, my experience running machinery was an asset that many farmers valued for the coming harvest. One of those farmers was a guy named Bill. This isn't his real name, but for anonymity, I'll change it, and I won't give the exact location. Bill offered me work on a grass farm in Tasmania, starting around the end of December and running until March. I'd only lined up work until Christmas time, so this fit perfectly into my schedule. Plus, it allowed me to miss out on the harsh Canadian winter. When I arrived in Tasmania, I was astonished by the scenery, rolling green hills and thick gum trees. To this day, and even after a second visit, the serenity of the place still takes my breath away. I say all this to paint a picture of how remote some parts of the island are. There are forests and passes that no man has stepped foot in due to how treacherous the landscape is. The farm was situated along a fertile stretch of land just before the Great Western Tiers. Some of the farmland took you far back into country that most people wouldn't even think of adventuring to with a vehicle to camp or hunt, let alone doing it in a tractor to cultivate farmland. Nevertheless, I found myself in the hills, working late into the night. I was trying to finish disking a couple of fields in preparation for them to be seeded in the next day or two. There wasn't much cell service out there, but I didn't mind. I enjoyed watching the sun prematurely set behind the striking peaks. Since cell phones aren't incredibly reliable in the more rural areas of Australia, farmers mainly rely on CB radios in their equipment and vehicles for communication. As anyone who has experience with CB radios will tell you, their range is abysmal if you don't have a direct line of sight to the person you're talking to. The signal is incredibly weak and full of static. For this reason, Bill's brother George had been checking in on me throughout the day, as the yard site where his house was located was the last one on the route to the cluster of fields I was in, before the road got too challenging. Every few hours he would zip out in his ute or a four-wheeler with a radio to check in on me. At around 9 p.m, he checked in for the last time as he was headed home for the night. I only had a couple of hours left anyway, so I figured I'd just finish up and take the tractor back to the yard site to save us some running around in the morning. As the night dragged on, I heard the distinct click of the radio when someone keys in to talk to you. I looked up to verify it, and sure enough, the small light that turns on when you're receiving a signal was glowing. I assumed it was just an electronic error, and reached up for the power button to reset it. As soon as my finger hovered over the off switch, I heard the distinctive giggle of a young girl. The girl's voice finished the giggle, then asked, "Do you like jazz?" There was a brief pause before the radio cut off. I know this isn't the most horrifying thing to hear, but considering the radio signal's strength, that girl's voice was so loud and clear it sounded like she was only a few feet away. Furthermore, no one on the farm had a daughter in the age range of the voice I heard. Needless to say, I took the tractor back to the yard early. The next day, I met up with the farm's mechanic, Taylor. Taylor is your typical no-nonsense Aussie tradie, about the furthest thing from a skeptic. He's also an avid hunter and knows all the spots within a 30-kilometre radius of the yard. Thinking it might have been hunters out that night with a young child, I asked him if any hunters might have been in the area doing a night shoot. Taylor said there was no way for hunters to get in where I was, unless they came down that same private road I used to access the fields. Taylor, of course, took alarm, thinking I'd seen people or lights, and that we might have trespassers. I decided to lay it out, possibly making myself look like a fool, and explained the experience to him. I didn't get the usual Aussie banter, but instead, a look of utter bewilderment and concern crossed his face. "Mate, I've got nothing for you. That's freaky," he said. Over the next few days, the rest of the workers heard my story, and they all came to ask about it. To my surprise, none of them mocked me or gave me a hard time. They all wore the same solemn expression as Taylor. Eventually, it came time for Grant to interview me about the event. Grant is Bill and George's dad, and has called those hills home for his entire 80-year life. Once I finished telling him, he grinned, looked up at the horizon and said, "I've been here long enough to know what goes on out there. Those things don't surprise me anymore. I look at those hills differently now. Tasmania has a storied past, dating back to its days as Van Diemen's Land, one of hardship, violence, and lawlessness. An island more lawless than the American West ever was, from prisoner farms to murderous cannibals and cryptic encounters. Aside from the steep banks and unmapped forests, maybe those hills have a bit more hidden within their immense stature. Story 7. I Was a Childhood Vampire, by Diane Head. I was 7 years old when my father allowed me to watch Bela Lugosi's famous 1931 portrayal of Dracula. Why he allowed it never ceases to confound me. It was the start of a brief childhood obsession with vampires, and was to be the cause of another incident that came back to bite me many years later. I sat next to my dad on the couch to view the old vampire movie. We had plenty of popcorn and I squeezed in under Dad's arm, riveted to the TV. I was hooked like a prize fish. From then on, I decided being a vampire would be way cool. It seemed so important to stand out in some unusual way, and being a vampire was as good as anything and better than most things. I made it my young life's mission to see all the vampire movies I could get away with. There was Dracula's Daughter, 1936, and Nosferatu, 1922. I tried the TV series Dark Shadows, getting a little girl crush on Barnabas Collins, but I couldn't watch enough of the old black and white vampire movies. Those were my favorites. When my parents had had enough of the old movies, I figured there had to be another way to learn about vampires. I made good use of our Saturday trips to the library. I started with the children's books, but didn't find a lot about vampires on the shelves, at least not in 1963. Taking caution that my mum and the librarian didn't catch on, I moved up to the grown-up stacks. The adult section had a treasure trove of vampire books. I found Bram Stoker's Dracula, but Stoker's vocabulary was leaps and bounds above mine. There was Carmilla, which I didn't understand at all, and the front cover artwork of the vampire and other tales of the macabre was off-putting, yuck, kissing. Nevertheless, I wedged them into my reading stack, looking around for my mom's sharp eyes before I snuck over to the checkout counter, carefully layering my stack of books to hide Dracula from prying eyes. All this involved a lot of mind-numbing shelf reading and a great deal of subterfuge. It was exhausting. Not to be deterred, I scoured the pages for drawings of Count Dracula. I didn't understand why adults wouldn't want illustrations in their books. The library's encyclopedia helped, and I traced the artwork carefully to take home to help me with my vampire study. Reading books and watching movies was all fine and good, but actually being a vampire would be way better. Clothes, that was the ticket. I knew I could find just the right things to wear from my very own closet. No need to shop. The next day, I pulled on my black leggings. Girls were to wear skirts and dresses to school, but leggings underneath were okay. I found a white shirt and tucked it into a black skirt. Perfect. I looked through our Halloween clothes and found a black cape. Just the ticket. Mum didn't object to the black and white outfit, but she'd pitch a fit if she knew I was taking a cape to school. I jammed it into my satchel. For the most part, no one noticed me. I was going to have to get radical. The next day, I stole Mum's eyebrow pencil. I could draw a widow's peak, just like Dracula's. Still, there was little response at school. None of my classmates asked me about the new look. Maybe they thought it was dirt. To be honest, it kinda looked like dirt. Stronger measures would be required. My grandmother lived 2 blocks away from the school. Making a detour the next day, I stopped by her house. After the obligatory greetings, I asked if we could go to the local Woolworth's 5 and dime. She was more than happy to go with me. I scoured Woolworth's shelves until I located a set of plastic vampire fangs. To make my costume better, I found a medallion on a ribbon that would be perfect for Count Dracula's medal. Grandma didn't ask. I didn't tell. I dug into my coin purse and pulled out a shiny dime to pay for my treasures. As Grandma drove, I laced the medallion around my neck, slid the fangs into my mouth, leaned out the window to see my reflection in the side view mirror, and admired my new look. I curled my fingers into talons and hissed. Yup, I looked great. The acid test would come tomorrow at school. Stopping by the bathroom before class, I took my new possessions out of my satchel. Leaning forward toward the mirror, I pulled out Mum's eyebrow pencil and drew 2 little black dots on my neck, where I imagined my jugular vein to be. I added the widow's peak, then I slipped the medallion on. As warm as the building was, the cape would have to wait until recess. In went the fangs, the coup de grace. People would notice. I grinned around the fangs as slobber oozed down my chin. I made my grand entrance into the classroom. I had Dracula's famous slink down to a fine science. It's not Halloween. one girl said, flinching away from me. No, I slurred around the long, slippery fangs. I'm a vampire. I got bit. You did not, another one sneered. That stuff is make-believe. I curled my fingers and lunged at her. A growl was enough to silence the disbeliever. See? I insisted, pointing at my neck. She huffed at me and turned her back. Clearly, desperate measures would have to be taken. At recess, I pulled the black cape from my satchel and swirled it around my shoulders. Then I got in the line. I was nothing if not patient and persistent. I have to avoid the sun, I informed a boy standing behind me. The fangs made comprehensible speech almost impossible. Why? He looked puzzled. Obviously, he needed to be educated. I'm a vampire. I took a defiant stance, my hands on my hips. Can't you tell? No, you're not, he stated, rolling his eyes. Vampires drink blood. That stopped me in my tracks. I hadn't thought of that. But it didn't keep me from staying under the trees at recess, whipping my cloak over my face, and stalking unwary victims. I stopped short of biting their necks. At home that night, I looked through the pantry while Mum and Dad were watching the evening news. Food coloring. Perfect. I pulled the red vial out of the box and palmed it, taking it to my room. I couldn't wait to get to school tomorrow. Sure enough, a drop or two of the red food coloring made the lunch milk resemble blood. I admit I got a lot of mileage from watching my classmates' faces as the red liquid ascended the straw. Emotions ranged from horror to wonder. And it stained my teeth, tongue and lips a bright cherry red. I absolutely loved it. My next brilliant idea was to encourage my playmates to stop by my house to play after school, and then I bribed my mum into saying that I was asleep in the basement, in a casket. The deal was, I'd clean the bathrooms for a month if she did it. Cleaning bathrooms was not my favorite chore, but it was worth peeking from the basement windows to see my friends' expressions. I don't know why I decided to ramp up my vampire activities, but I did, and it proved to be my undoing. One day at school, the shade of Count Dracula came over me. I looked for a victim on the playground. Wrapping my cape over my arm and covering my face, I snuck up behind Ricky Meyer. Ricky lived next door and was not the sharpest crayon in the box. He was busy doing major surgery on a hangnail and not paying attention to Count Dracula. I should have considered his bulldog of a mother before I nipped him in the neck. I ended up in the office. The principal looked at my get-up and shook her head. I wasn't entirely sure why she kept biting her lower lip. I was too scared to ask if she was a vampire fan too. Ricky ended up at the doctor's office. He got some sort of shot. I think it might have been a rabies shot, but I wasn't sure. He wasn't speaking to me. Neither was his mother. My mum got a call from the principal and a visit from Ricky's mother, which didn't turn out to be all that wonderful for me. I guess she told my dad because the vampire movie marathons ceased, and the bathroom cleaning lasted 3 months instead of 1. Sheer torture. It didn't stop me from reading scary stories, though. Tons of them. Years passed. A little over 60 of them. When an invitation to our 50th class reunion came by email, I decided to go. I found a sleek pair of black satin trousers and a romantically arranged white silk blouse. I draped a black wool jacket over my shoulders, knowing this venue would be chilly. A long gold necklace with a ruby pendant completed my ensemble. In my opinion, my outfit was classic chic. The second I stepped into the reception hall, the comments began. Hey guys, there's the vampire chick. Ooh, nice choice of clothes. Is that what fashionable vamps wear these days? Is your mum letting you out of the basement now? How's that casket working out for you? Who ordered the steak tartare? All eyes turned my way as a plate holding a steak literally swimming in blood was placed before me. I hadn't ordered that. I pushed it away before I gagged. They weren't done yet. Please pass the garlic bulbs. Send down that bottle of red. And then someone tossed a set of plastic fangs on my dessert plate. There were endless jokes about biting and vamps and Transylvania. I endured about an hour of light comments before I'd had enough fun and games. But there was more. Hey, isn't she the one that bit Ricky Meyer? Ricky, come over here. Maybe you'll get lucky enough to get another little love bite. Everyone snickered except me. My face burned with horror. Ricky had transformed in the intervening years. Gone was the geeky kid. Here was a man who dressed like he belonged on the front cover of GQ and was a cross between People's Sexiest Man Alive and Mr. Atlas. I wanted to slide under the table with a magnum of red. Instead, I braced myself on the table and pushed back my chair. The lie I'd told as a child with a vivid imagination, had come back to haunt me. I picked up my black jacket, swirled it over my shoulders, and strode out, head held high. From my pocket, I pulled out the vampire fangs someone had tossed at me. They fit perfectly.